Argh, not another podcast about book publishing, hosted by William May, in which the author finds himself embroiled in a podcast about book publishing.
Hi, Denise here, and I am back to introduce you to part 2 of William May's The Monster Was Covered with Spaghetti. We hope you enjoyed part 1, and now sit back, relax, enjoy part 2. And remember, you can always find William on social media, on his website, Substack, well, pretty much everywhere. Enjoy. Part 2, The Monster Was Covered with Spaghetti.
It's difficult to explain to anyone who has never had a thought that isn't their own. Like if you had only ever seen your own handwriting and suddenly saw the handwriting of another person for the first time, you would recognize it and say it wasn't the same, but maybe not be able to explain to someone else who had only ever seen their own handwriting. You might say that the letter A looked different, that they might ask you what it looked like, if not an A, and you would say it still looked like an A, but a different A, and that wouldn't make much sense. The Monster Was Covered with Spaghetti by William May, read by the author. Part 2. Once I had sat there a moment, I became aware of the thoughts that were in my head. It is difficult to explain the thing about those thoughts. They were, in most ways, the same as any thought I might have, had all the qualities of my own thoughts, but they were not my thoughts in some way that was quite clear, even if they were in my mind and being thought in the way I would have thought them if they were my own genuine thoughts. It's difficult to explain to anyone who has never had a thought that is not their own. Like, if you had only ever seen your own handwriting and suddenly saw the handwriting of another person for the first time, you would recognize it wasn't the same, but maybe not be able to explain it to someone else who had only ever seen their own handwriting. You might say that the letter A looked different, and they might ask you what it looked like if not an A, and you would say it still looked like an A, but a different A, and that would not make much sense. Also, imagine if what was written in that handwriting was the same as what you would have written, and if it was also handwriting that you were writing yourself, but it was not your handwriting, was just coming out of your pen, the pen in your hand, and writing things you might write in the words you would use if you wrote those things. That is what it was like, more or less, only not at all, because it was in my mind and was my thoughts. It started as soon as I was touching those roots, or I think it did, even if I didn't notice it at the very first. The thoughts were very calm and kept repeating that it was all going to be fine, and that even the things that might seem unusual didn't need to be considered alarming or upsetting, that it was all going to be sorted out. At first, I was a bit confused why I would be thinking that and what it was as well that seemed weird about the thoughts themselves. And then I realized it was a sort of message. I mean, I don't think the tree wanted me to think that they were my own thoughts. I think the tree was telling me it would all be all right. I wanted to ask Albie if the tree was talking to him too, but the idea that it might not be, that it might be like the worms again, that kept me from doing it. Things were making so little sense already, I didn't need any more reason to doubt my experiences. I had a feeling that something was about to come. Not a conscious thought, not words or an image or idea, but just an impulse to look and watch. I noticed that Albie and the chief were both watching in the same way, so even if they didn't have any idea the tree was talking to them, I think it must have been because I am certain that impulses, that awareness was not my own thought. They were looking the same way as I was, so I figured it made a certain kind of sense. Maybe it isn't sound logic, really, but I prefer to think of it this way than to imagine that I wasn't actually having those experiences. That the idea that I might be hallucinating was, to be honest, kind of comforting. But not if what I was hallucinating was only the last few details about talking worms and talking trees and not the entire general tableau of bizarre. I was looking up. The worms were still there, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. The worms were just floating about, and they didn't seem to mind. It seemed that, to me, they seemed to be calm, at least. I suppose that is just me making it up, really. I didn't see them squirming or struggling against the void. So I think it must have been calmness, but how would I know? They're worms. They may not have any idea of calmness. I wondered why I was watching them if they were doing nothing and nothing else seemed to be happening. But I kept on watching. I watched and watched. Nothing happened, but I did not look away. Minutes went by. The worms had moved about a bit, but nothing more. Didn't seem as if anything was about to happen. I looked over, and Albie was still looking. So was the chief. I still had that feeling, too, that sense of anticipation. What was there to do but look anyhow? Then there was a burst of light from behind the worms, as if a curtain had been drawn off from a window and the sun was passing through. The worms twisted about, seemed to be annoyed at the light, or perhaps just surprised. I do not know. I cannot say what worms are thinking. I'm not even certain it is worth speculating on what their behavior means in such terms. Then again, these worms did speak to me, or I think they did. I don't know. Maybe not wanting to think that they could talk is why I don't want to imagine what they were feeling. Doesn't really matter, because they were not feeling it for very long, because it turns out that the reason that light was shining through was because an opening had been made. A hole that let the sunlight down, and that hole had been made by birds. Very big birds. They were huge, these birds. Had busted through to soar down from above, diving straight down from the sky, their wings broad and dark, with the blaze of the sky behind them. There were so many of them. A great, uncountable flock. I watched them swooping down, wondered what was to come, but also, a part of me felt the knowledge of their hunger. Oh, bother, the worm voice said in my mind. This is why we came down below in the first place. No, that is a lie, was the thought that was in my head. And also, for some reason, you could have reported in and avoided all this. The birds cawed what I think was approval, but they did not speak. The caw was loud and sharp and echoed through the dark, empty around us. For a moment, all the birds seemed to raise up, to lift their wings and recede back towards the sky. But then, as a single rush, they began to dive down, dropping fast and sharp, straight at the worms. When they were just upon them, each of the birds opened its beak, and soon all the worms were gone, devoured. And all that remained were the birds, soaring about, sliding past one another so close. It seemed impossible. The rush of their motion was great enough that I could feel the breeze even so far away. The acid! The acid! I heard a shriveling, wormy voice say inside my mind. You are just fine, I found myself thinking with the tree's thoughts. One of the birds flew into my eye line and opened up its beak. Just enough that I could see the worm hadn't, in actuality, been eaten, merely scooped up and captured. You won't let me have any fun, will you? harumphed the voice. The birds began to fly all about, with one coming near us. Jump on its back, I unexpectedly found myself shouting to Albie and the chief. Albie looked at me a bit surprised, but he seemed to trust I knew what I was talking about. I didn't know what the chief was thinking, really, but when the bird came, only Albie and I jumped, and the bird flew back around to get the chief, but he just stayed there with his arms folded. I don't think that is a licensed form of transport, he said. I don't think we have any choice, Albie said. Do you want to just stay down here? Not particularly, but I'm an officer of the law. I don't want to be seen thwarting my responsibilities. I don't think anyone will notice or care, Albie said. Not when you're such a great hero. Hero? The chief seemed intrigued. You're saving us after the big hole swallowed us up. I mean, that's why you jumped in here to begin with, isn't it? Well, of course it is. And now you are conscripting the available resources to improvise a solution. That sounds quite good. If you can repeat it, I would like to write that phrase out so I can explain it to the press. I'll be glad to, but perhaps you can join us for our escape and we can take care of that when we are back on solid ground. At last, the chief jumped on the back of the giant bird and we were off. The feathers of the bird were soft and smooth, and the motion of the flight was gentle, the cool breeze moving over me as I laid my head forward onto the back of the creature. I noticed now, again, for the first time since we had fallen, how sore I was from running, how it had worn me down. I didn't simply fall asleep. It was a choice. I did not know what would be where we would go. I didn't trust that there could be safety. I knew this was not safety on the back of this creature. Even leaving off the chief and his gun were still in the mix. In the new world, I thought, comfort is more than one may be able to ever expect, and I shut my eyes. I was tired enough that was all I needed. I woke up feeling refreshed, as though I had slept far longer than a nap. It seemed as if I had been many hours asleep, and I could recall bits of dreaming and waking, moments in fragment, enough to speak of passing time and a long rest. I was still on the bird's back, still soaring off. I didn't know how far or long or where we were. I looked around, saw a bright sky above, but I couldn't see the ground beneath us, only more sky in all directions. Albie was sitting up, knees folded beneath his chin with arms wrapped around them, his head plopped on top. He looked at me. Waking up then, he said. Seems to be. How long was I asleep? Not certain. It has felt like a long time, I think. Could be an hour or two, though. Since we broke into the sky, there hasn't been any way to tell time. Feels like it should have been night already if it was day when we started flying, but it's still just as bright as before. Looked around and noticed something. Where's the chief? He was giving the bird too much trouble, couldn't be trusted not to do something stupid or dangerous. Literally pointed the gun at the back of the bird's head and demanded it take him to the nearest precinct. So what happened? I imagined him thrown off into the void, not entirely certain if I was perturbed by the idea or by my comfort with his absence, even under such circumstances. Take a look for yourself, Albie said, crawling out towards the bird's wing with great care. Just hold on tight, he said, encouraging me to join him. I crawled along, digging my hands into the feathers as gently as I could. I tried to remain flat, slinking on my belly. I felt more stable, and I worried about the chance of a gust of wind pushing beneath me, shearing me from the bird. Albie watched as if I was being ridiculous. He had clearly taken the time while I was sleeping to acclimate. Or perhaps, I wondered after considering his previous performance, if it was just a natural talent for adaptation. if it was merely me being deficient in that same capacity. When I had made my way far enough, Albie hung his head down over the edge, then looked back at me in anticipation. I sucked in for a moment, not all that comfortable with what was expected. But then I leaned forward and looked. For a moment, it was terrifying, thinking I might lose my balance, but the bird was flying with a smooth care and seemed to have tipped itself slightly, so the side we were on was now roughly perpendicular to the pull of gravity. It didn't seem so dangerous, and the view was grand. I looked about for a few moments before Albie was able to direct my attention towards the bird's talons and the chief, who was being held between them. The grip was such that his arms were pinned in place, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. At least from this distance, he was clearly yelling, but the rushing air pulled his voice off before I could hear it. I looked down, tried to determine what was beneath us, if not where we were, but the only things I saw were clouds and sky and more birds. On and on, I saw nothing as far as sight could reach, what appeared to be forever. I did not worry. I knew that there had to be some place, that there couldn't be only emptiness in the backs of birds and clouds. I knew that other things had existed, had to still be out there. Maybe we were over an ocean and the sea was reflecting back the image of the sky, I thought, though I didn't believe this even the littlest tiny bit. We flew on, and time stretched by without much seeming to change at all. And I wondered about why it was that it seemed so long, and yet I wasn't hungry, and Albie wasn't, and we hadn't had even any drop of water in however long either. It must have been less time somehow, I thought, but I didn't think it could have been because it felt so long. But who can know when nothing changes and you haven't had any way to mark the passage of time? Albie told me when he looked down that the chief's beard had grown, but I couldn't remember if he had a beard to start with or not. I swear he never had a beard before, Albie said. Well, I never paid much attention to that, I said. A lot of was going on when he showed up. It was something to argue about more than anything. There was so little to do, and we seemed to be fine, and time was passing, or not really passing, just continuing and remaining and being. Things didn't seem to be happening. The bird flew, and we stayed on its back waiting. Albie's efforts to convince me the chief did not ever have a beard was something to do. To be honest, I wasn't even all that certain if I could see a beard on him when I tried to look. Eventually, I grew tired of the argument and told Albie that he was right, that the chief had a brand new beard grown entirely during our flight. I didn't want to keep listening to his insistence any longer. It had been fine, had been occupying for a bit, but now... I suppose it didn't matter if he was correct in a literal sense. I was certain of how long it had been, even if there was nothing to show for it. It could not have been only a few minutes or hours. I was certain it had been far longer than that, with or without the chief's beard. After a time, though, something did begin to happen. We began to see other birds flying in the same direction. They were all gigantic, seemed to be the same birds who had all appeared together and departed, and now they seemed to all be converging back around us. On their backs were other people. I could not see them well, could not say I recognized anyone or even knew what they looked like beyond the general shape of a person. But I was guessing it was all the people that had been disrupted when the ground opened up and the whole town fell apart. That feeling became even stronger when I saw more birds arriving with things I did recognize on their backs, like cars. I thought I could have been ones from the road when it collapsed, or the familiar wall of some building, once a whole house even. That last was painted a particular shade of blue that stirred some memory of the place, though I cannot be certain from where or when, just that I think it was a house I had seen before. was still the same in other ways. The flight continuing without sight of anything beyond sky. And now, these other birds and all they bore with them. The flight did not seem all that different, though. And any initial excitement about the appearance of those neighbors wore off as our journey stretched forward. I wonder why I was not even a bit thirsty, even longed to feel thirst, to desire the desire for a drink, despite the knowledge that none would come. It troubled me, as I was certain it had been far too long to not have a drink. It must have been days at the least. I couldn't think of it having been any less than that. Even a few days seemed an inadequate span, really. But I could not know, not for certain. That was when I began to count. It was all I could think to do that might offer some type of clear evidence of time's passage. I just started counting. It was simple enough to just assume that each number took about a second or so to say, and I knew that it would take longer as the numbers got bigger, but if I got to big enough numbers, it would have taken long enough to be clear it wasn't just a few minutes that seemed to be stretching out forever, but a real amount of time. I remember once hearing that it took about 12 days to count to 1 million. So if I got close to that, I'd be sure I would have a sense of how much time had gone by. I actually had to stop and start my counting because Albie wanted an explanation of what I was doing, and that didn't seem unreasonable. I could imagine my spending all this time trying to count while he was waiting for me to explain, wanting it, and I didn't imagine that would be anything at all good for either of us. So I stopped and told him, and he asked if he could count with me, and maybe we should trade off at times, he said, so one of us could take a break. I didn't know what the break would be, what good it would do in either of us, really, because doing nothing was the only thing I could think of other than the counting. But I didn't have a problem with his wanting to take part, too. I would have been fine with it, but he kept getting bored and trying to get me to stop. We'd get to a few thousand and he would look at me and ask why we were even doing this. It wasn't a huge problem because I would just use whatever total I knew we had reached as the starting point if I had to stop again, but it was annoying. It probably shouldn't have bothered me very much, but the counting was, I think, the only thing I had. It was a way to keep control, maybe, by taking a measurement of a sort. It was, I suppose, an attempt to have some kind of understanding, or if not really that, because it could never make it easier to actually understand, a bit more information and certainty. I'd be more certain about a single detail, about the passage of time itself. Albie didn't quite get why it mattered to me in the first place. He didn't need to think of it that way. Maybe because he was sure about the chief's beard, or because he just didn't really care as much, accepted the way it was, especially since there wasn't anything to be done about it right away, anyhow. After a time when, despite innumerable stops and starts to deal with Albie, I had counted up to 500,000, I didn't think it mattered much anyhow. That high, and I was sure we were days on, probably weeks, considering I had only been counting for what seemed to be a small part of the journey. So I had enough evidence to accept my experience of the passage of time, which was all it was about, I suppose. Albie seemed to be a bit relieved when I stopped counting. It was the first time he had been upset about anything throughout the entire Odyssey. Or maybe I'm wrong and he wasn't really upset at all. Maybe he was just frustrated, or he really was upset all along and just great at not showing it most of the time. It could just have been he wanted my attention and was annoyed I was distracted by numbers. He had as little to do as I did, and counting was not for him, so maybe bothering me was all he had left. After I stopped counting, he still wanted attention, so it was probably just that. Not at all that he was uncomfortable with my making certain our situation was as weird as it seemed to me. I keep forgetting that he was already sure about that before I had even started to count, because he was so certain about the chief growing a beard. Anyhow, I stopped counting, or mostly stopped. I'd find myself counting at times, just the habit of it, and I didn't think it hurt to add the numbers to my total when I did that. So I was still counting a bit, but not as a plan, not with any serious intent. Without much else to do, it's easy for a mind to just wander off, and counting became a thing my mind just did when it started to wander off. I stopped counting as a thing, but I still found myself doing it at least sometimes, and I had already reached a count of 700,000, including the original count, not as a whole new one, when things started to happen. First, Albie saw it, and he came and yelled for me to look, and I looked, and I could see it too, that long shaft of trunk stretching off in both directions. So far it seemed to go on forever. It was the Munster, or another tree of the same sort maybe. I'm not sure why we had to fly so long if we were only going back to the same tree, but it seemed as if that was what was happening, though there wasn't any ground to land on. Instead of landing, we just began to circle around the tree, still a great distance off, but each concentric ring of our flight seemed to bring us just a bit closer. All the birds around us were taking similar trajectories, circling the tree at a distance, as if it were some form of military operation, with forces surrounding the target from safety. I wondered if there was a reason current circumstances resembled such an action, if there was a danger or some type of battle ahead. A great distress shook me as things continued, seeming to escalate, for in time the birds began to it seemed, attack the tree. Or so it appeared to me. It was like this. A line of birds broke from the circle, diving straight at the trunk, one in front with others behind in a rigid formation. When the first was quite close, it spat something towards the tree. I couldn't see what it was they spat, as we were still quite distant, but I saw the general gesture of it and saw each subsequent bird follow suit. Unleashing a similar assault when it reached the front. I didn't understand why the birds would attack the tree, or was this some sort of distant other tree that was at war with our own? Had the worms been sent by a greater enemy from far off, and this was retaliation? I imagined the possibility that some grand war was ongoing, that somehow it had come to our little town, and now we were at the front lines of an unexpected battle grown around motivations unknown and impossible to fathom. I watched as we wound our way around the tree and into the formation ourselves. It reminded me of something, an image I had seen in, I think, an old cartoon, planes diving towards a target, each one falling into a glide as it launched a short attack and then flew off, only to be replaced by the next. I waited, watched the backs of the birds in front of us as they traced the path we would soon be following. But as we reached towards the front, it became possible to see what was happening, and I was reassured that I could dismiss my assumption of conflict. Here is what I came to observe as we approached. The birds were spitting out white globs, which stuck to the tree trunk. So many had accumulated that it was now a large mess. I was uncertain what these things were, white and sticky looking. But they weren't, I knew, munitions. It still seemed strange, but the sense of anxiety I had felt ebbed as I wondered what the great mass forming before us was. That was when the first cocoon, for that is what those white forms were, began to crack open. I recalled the worms and how they had been carried away in the mouths of the birds. It seemed they had formed these shells while inside the beaky cells as we traveled. Now that we were here and they were set loose, the cocoons began to crack open and the occupants emerged into the sky as moths. Great violet moths with a sheen to their wings that made them seem almost iridescent when the light addressed it from certain angles. More and more of them came into the sky, but they didn't travel far, instead remaining close to the trunk and the great pile of cocoons that had accumulated below. We were far from the last to reach the trunk ourselves and deposit a cocoon to that great conglomeration. And already it had grown to be such a large mass that it was impossible to see the far end, and we dove in to make our deposit. Think how many cocoons that must have been, how many thousands of those gigantic moths were about. Many had landed by now, clinging to the trunk with their wings straight behind them. Once we had laid our cocoon with the rest, the bird carrying us rose up again, slowly orbiting the great trunk and the white mass that now decorated it. More birds were still coming. I couldn't even tell how many it might be, thousands, millions. I couldn't see the end of the procession on the horizon, only a great shadow that undulated into form as the flock continued forward. It was a long time as we swooped around again and again. More and more birds, more and more moths, and the great mass of cocoons still grew, but it was harder to tell any longer. I'd watched as it swelled, but now, with so many others crowding the sky, it was often only possible to catch a glimpse here or there between the wings and tails of our neighbors. Hours or days or weeks of it. Who could think of time any longer? I'd lost any track, any count I'd made before. I let myself give it up in the absurdity of the slog. We circled about innumerable times as more and more moths emerged. There were still too many of the birds on the horizon for it to be close to ending, I thought. Albie still seemed quite amused by it all. Sat staring out at the sky, head darting back and forth to follow one bird or another, then focusing on a stream of moths floating up from beneath, having just, it is presumed, emerged from their cocoons. I watched him as he watched the sky. We'd been there amongst these great swarms for some time now, but it still fascinated him. At last I asked him, "What is it that keeps you watching?" "It's just exciting, really, I guess. Besides, there isn't much else to do." "No," I said. "I suppose not." "I do like talking," he said, turning to look over at me for the first time during the conversation. "Yes, it's nice to talk," I said. "Yup, when we do." "Yeah, I've been preoccupied. Worried." He gave the word weight. "Aren't you?" I asked. "No, why would I worry? What even is there to worry about anyhow? Maybe we had things to worry about a while back, but it all just seems to be beyond that now. And we don't seem to have anything we can do about whatever happens anyhow," he said. "I don't like not having any choice and not knowing what is happening, and I'm confused by it all, and it makes no sense, and I guess that scares me. I guess I'm worried about things because they are worrying to me. I know it doesn't do any good, but that doesn't make it better. It doesn't stop any of this from troubling me." "We've been up here on this bird," Albie said, "for weeks or months or longer, and nothing has changed. I don't want anything to drink or to eat. I only sleep when I feel like taking a rest, and that isn't all that often, really. We exist in a state of grace, right? Isn't that what it gets called when people don't age or change or need anything and don't get hurt either? I don't know that we can't. I mean, that getting hurt isn't possible. But I've felt fine all this time. Not even a headache or a sore foot, and that's enough for me. It's a good thing, I think, really. But for you, it's just strange and concerning. Is that what you're telling me? Because it doesn't make much sense, that way of thinking about it at all, not to me. I didn't know how to respond to this. He was right in some way, yes, but I still didn't agree. Anyhow, was I ungrateful in the face of a miracle? It was miraculous to not need sustenance for so long, of course. But the whole ordeal seemed to undermine that designation, the destruction that led us here. I didn't know what to say about any of it, so I just nodded and hummed and stood there, looking out at the birds and the moths and thinking that there was something amazing about it. Even so, I wasn't calmed. I felt what Elby had said was not unaffected. Still, I didn't feel any better, not within myself. The nature of our predicament remained a source of dread. It wasn't that I wished to be hungry, to be starved, dehydrated, dying, or already dead from so long without sustenance of any sort. I didn't wish for things to be worse in that way. But that didn't make it right. Didn't mean that I could set aside the disturbing aspects of our predicament. I might have spent more time considering the issue, but there was a sudden lurch as the bird we were riding on shifted his course without warning. I was knocked prone as we began to dive straight down at great speed, a speed that seemed to be increasing as we went. Then, sudden as it had begun, the bird was once more slow and had again steadied, but something had changed. At first, I was not at all certain about what, but then I realized that we were in the world again. I mean to say, the sky was not alone any longer. It was now the sky above a land that could be seen below. We were still quite far above, distant enough that everything looked tiny except for the monster, whose trunk still remained a great pillar rising, branches seeming to spread amongst the clouds. Beneath us, things were small and still and seemed still to be unreal, just a diorama. As we descended, though, that world expanded into life. What is more, it was not merely a place. But it became clear during our approach, the same town we had left long ago. I knew it couldn't be the same place, but I saw the buildings, the streets, the shape of the lamps by the side of the road. It had all been destroyed. It had been swallowed up into the hollow of the earth. Yet here we were, returning to find it as though nothing had happened. Only I didn't think we were returning. It had to be a new place, right? Not the same one. It couldn't have been the same place. That place was destroyed. It had to be another place, a different place, but it all seemed the same. And the closer we came, the realer the toy set town grew, the more it seemed as if it must be what had been there before. What I knew for certain had been destroyed. I recalled, yes, the buildings we had seen being carted here, and it might be that it was a reconstruction built with as much of the original as could be salvaged, but that should still be, shouldn't it, a bit different, right? We glided down, slowing more and more as we approached the ground. Before we landed, the great bird that carried us raised its wings, slowing just a bit more and reared a bit. Soon, the chief of police, who I had almost forgotten about, launched up before us, tossed into the air right before us. I worried for a moment, but the bird had great skill and caught the man a bit roughly on the back of a wing. Before landing to allow us to depart, the chief had been rolled to the ground with a gesture that was far from delicate, but only unpleasant, not so violent as to provoke injury. The chief bounced to the ground with small grunts and groans, but seemed fine. I'd thought the bird would be about to land, that we might depart, but once the chief had been unloaded, the creature raised back to the air, then turned and flew towards the monster, with us still aboard. I was a bit confused, even concerned that we had not been let off, for I was eager to be home. But then I thought, can't really be home at all. What good was it to return when it was to a new place, even if that new place seemed the same? I didn't have long to contemplate, for we were only being taken back to the place where this had all started. The bird landed a few feet from the trunk of that great tree and lowered itself close to the ground, then extended a wing as a ramp for our departure. The care was so opposed to how the chief had been flung down that it put the hostility the bird felt into sharp relief. I imagined how unpleasant it must have been to hold him there, the chief, in his talons, bent for so long. Not, I supposed, a picnic for the chief either. That was when I realized I had not looked to see if the chief had grown a beard or not. In the commotion, I hadn't thought of it. Perhaps I wondered I would see him soon enough as we went back to town and he would still have the whiskers. Of course, if they were gone by then, I wouldn't know if he had already shaved them off unless I were to be direct and ask, which I suspected would not be a wise thing to do considering recent events from the chief's perspective. I would have to accept that it had been as long as it had felt it had been, which was too long, was impossibly long, but also not any sort of time that matters, not real time at all. It had felt like forever, but that was only a feeling. It would have been better to have looked at the chief and know, as it was considering it just made me dizzy. It doing you good to be back? Albie asked me. I don't think we are back, I said. Not really. How could this not be home? Everything is the way I remember. Look over there. Our footprints are still visible in the dirt. The ones from when we came out here. It has the same pattern as my shoes. See? Even there, where it's cracked, he said, showing me the bottom of his foot for comparison. How could our footprints still be there? The worms tore up all this ground when they chased us. But they are. Look at this. That is my footprint. That one there. That one is you. I think if you look at your shoe, it matches just right. I'm sure because it's your footprint. Okay, I admit the possibility that maybe you are right. They aren't the original ones for real. But what's it matter if everything is the same anyhow? I didn't know what I should say to him. This world is not the one it was before, no matter how it seems. I am not so certain why it is easy for anyone to accept that.
This is William May saying goodbye. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends. If not, please share it with your enemies.
Argh, Not Another Podcast About Book Publishing, is produced by Denise Marsa Meggie Dimitrova and William May. Please visit WilliamMayWrites.com for social media links, recited poems, and more.